Hello, I'm back, but only to say welcome to Pamela. Pamela, are you there to join us from Brisbane? If I'm not wrong, from Australia. Welcome, and thanks for waking up. Well, actually, staying up late, I should say. Good, Pamela. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to have you for the second time around. We had a fantastic presentation, very warm feedback at MEF Connect Innovators. So we couldn't not but extend a welcome. And you were talking about something so close to our hearts. So well done. Today you're going to talk about the market and the grey routes. Is that true?
That's right. So I have some data to share, and I hopefully have some insights and some challenging opinions and questions that I hope will maybe hopefully set the scene for the rest of the day, which it sounds like you've got a fantastic lineup, really meaty kind of sessions coming up today. So I'm looking forward to hopefully dipping into those that I can before I fall asleep over my laptop sometime in the early hours of the morning.
Don't worry, Pamela. All the fun will be available later as a recording version, but try to stay with us. We'll love you and your comments. And you're right. Let's set the agenda. I'll leave you now to do your presentations to all of our viewers right now. There's a Q&A button next to the video. Well, say area. Add your questions there. We'll try to read them and bring them back to you. Pamela, now our presentations is all yours.
Great, thank you, Dario, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. And I'm really happy to be here again today, presenting to the MEF audience. It's a great pleasure for me to do that. So yes, and obviously I thank MEF for the opportunity to do so. So just a brief introduction. I'm a principal analyst for advanced messaging and communications with Omdia. So I sit within the service provider consumer practice, and that's in the service provider pillar. So just to, right, need to try and move my slides on. There we go. So just a brief introduction. So I've been covering the communications apps and services market for a number of years now, looking at what the telcos are doing, but also what the messaging apps are doing, looking at the A2P space across that ecosystem, where the messaging apps are starting to come in there now. And of course, that includes RCS. So there are a number of products that I produce for Omdia on a range of markets in this area. I also work in consultancy, and I have spoken and chaired at a number of industry events, including Mobile World Congress. So I've been covering the industry for quite a while now, and just amazed at all the changes we've seen since the early 2000s, for example, when mobile data was really just starting out, and SMS was probably the only game in town. It's very much changed since then. So just a brief sort of overview of Omdia. We're a global research and consultancy firm. We operate in almost 200 countries around the world, spread across EMEA, the Americas, and Asia Pacific. And our aim is to provide our clients with timely, reliable, extensive intelligence that they can use when making their business decisions and strategic decisions. So we're a combination of a number of companies. We have acquired over the years, most recently acquiring 4 companies: Tractica, IHS Markit, and Heavy and Light Reading. And this is now what we are now, which is Omdia. So today's agenda, three sort of main things that I want to cover. First of all, I want to put the A2P SMS market into context, and I have some data and forecasts that can help there. Also, some digital consumer insights survey results that I'm hoping will sort of help set the agenda and really sort of underline why we need to make sure that the A2P SMS market is A2P SMS channel is as clean as it possibly can be for the companies that are using it. Then I'll obviously have a look at grey routes. This is kind of maybe a little bit of an elephant in the room. I guess we all know that they're out there. We know that this market is being addressed by telcos and by vendors with with a number of deployments of SMS firewalls and revenue assurance platforms and so on. But it's obviously had an impact on the A2P SMS market. And so, maybe there are some challenges I can put to the ecosystem today. And then finally, I'll just finish off with some key takeaways to summarize, some of the things I've been talking about today. So let's look at the A2P SMS market. So these are our telco mobile messaging forecasts. If you're in the presentation I did back in February, you might sort of recognize this slide. Don't worry, I'm not going to repeat all the slides from that presentation, but this is a good one just to provide an overview of the A2P SMS and the P2P SMS market. So, we know that P2P SMS is going to decline. We're forecasting from about 60.5 billion in 2020 to 35 billion by 2025. But obviously, telcos still need to provide P2P SMS. It's very much a hygiene factor for them. They'll need to be able to continue offering it even as they're rolling out their 5G networks. And a large part of that is the fact that A2P SMS still remains and is likely to remain for a number of years a key customer communications channel between enterprises and their customers. Quite important that telcos still continue to support that. Alongside the decline in P2P SMS revenues, there'll obviously a decline in P2P SMS traffic. So we're forecasting fairly flat decline. P2P SMS, I think, has remained fairly resilient. We, haven't seen that falling off of a cliff that I guess we all expected when messaging apps started to become so popular and so widely penetrated. It's still right up there alongside generating, a fair amount less traffic than it used to, but still quite respectable. We're still forecasting about 5 trillion messages by 2025 from 5.7 trillion last year. But I mean, the big growth story is obviously in A2P SMS, and we see that that's going to buoy the total SMS market. We're expecting growth from just under 80 billion in 2020 up to over 100 billion by 2025, with A2P SMS traffic growing from just over 2 trillion to just over 3 trillion. So we see that obviously during the pandemic, we've had this spike of P2P SMS traffic, but it's likely that will start to fall again. More telcos we know have already introduced price plans that include unlimited SMS or large SMS bundles, and that's helped to keep it resilient. People sort of still use it because it's there on their device. It's easy for them to use. They know they can contact anyone. We don't have this fragmentation of SMS that we have in the messaging app market. And so, as I was saying, we're going to see A2P SMS driving telcos' continued support of SMS in their 5G networks. So it's going to be incredibly important that telcos still continue to support SMS for that reason. So looking at vertical markets in A2P, one of the things that we also looked at was vertical splits across the various industries. So what we're seeing is that on the whole, across all regions, in fact, that banking and finance and social media and messaging apps are going to generate the most or the highest proportion of traffic across the 10 or 12 vertical industries we've got listed there. Obviously, some markets are going to or have suffered already from the pandemic. Over the last 12 months or so, these markets are ones that have suffered overall, travel and hospitality. But others have had a positive effect from COVID-19. So obviously, there's been a huge increase in A2P SMS traffic from things like two-factor authentication, security, one-time passwords, verification. People who, consumers who are just locked down in their homes, are spending much more of their time online. They're working from home. They're learning from home, and obviously the tools that they're using, their online tools they're using for sign-on, single sign-on, and so forth, require this level of security. We expect, though, that once COVID-19, as that eases and people are able to travel, A2P SMS traffic in that sector will pick up again. This is data from our Consumer Digital Insights, Digital Consumer Insights survey. We ran this across 12 countries towards the end of last year. It's a survey we've been doing for a number of years now. And so one of the questions we asked is, how do you typically communicate with the customer care team from organizations you buy services from or interact with? And so, these could be a bank or a government department or a healthcare provider and so forth. So as you can see here, SMS, is one of those top 3 channels. Email is obviously still quite important, voice calls, and it really very much depends on the use cases as well. So, we're looking at things like for service notifications. We see that there's 39% of respondents to the survey across the 12 countries, and there was about just over 12,000 respondents we had there. They were using SMS for these service notifications. Quite a few more still using email, and then for other use cases we saw a high use of voice services. So for things like troubleshooting and technical support, on that bottom line there, you can see that purple sort of bar is quite long. So again, when you see this chart and this data, it really does underline how important A2P SMS remains for consumers when they're interacting with their service providers, when they're interacting with businesses. We looked at chat apps as well. We are noticing an increase in the number of consumers that are using chat apps, but as you can see, it's still, quite a small proportion of total usage overall in terms of preferred interaction channel between consumers and their businesses. So it will grow. Obviously, we've got the messaging apps really trying to make that a bigger part of their business globally. Companies, apps in China and Japan and South Korea are pretty much already there. But it's the WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, Instagram, Viber. These other apps are all sort of working to really get into that business market segment as well, that business communication segment as well. So they shouldn't be underestimated, but they're not quite there yet. A2P SMS there's a very robust ecosystem around that already, and we know that that obviously some of the players in that ecosystem, from a provider perspective, from an SMS and a customer engagement perspective, are making it easier for businesses to use messaging apps. There's a few challenges. How do businesses know which of their customers are using the apps? And obviously, these are challenges that the vendors and the service providers can help them solve. And which apps are they using in a number of markets? We know that penetration is split between, say, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. In other markets, WhatsApp is very popular, to the exclusion of almost every other app in that market. So in markets like South Africa and Brazil and so forth, you've got well over 90% penetration of WhatsApp among smartphone users in those markets. So, there are some challenges, I think, for the messaging apps in terms of engaging with consumers in a number of markets. But they will be resolved. It's again about the revenues, where there are revenues, and we know that Facebook really needs to diversify its revenue base. It's mostly advertising at the moment, so it's coming from the messaging app side. If we look at the markets that we surveyed, and you'll see the list of them there, we see that consumers in mostly emerging markets are using SMS for interacting with businesses. With the exception perhaps of France, which is right up there in the top 5 or 6 there. So I think France has always been quite a strong market for SMS, and clearly is bucking the trend there. But what's interesting is the markets that are here in the top 5 or 6 are also markets where we're seeing still this high penetration of messaging apps. So China, for example, with Weixin, and South Africa with WhatsApp, Malaysia again with WhatsApp, Indonesia, Brazil. So, even though these countries are ones that are using, have a high penetration of those messaging apps, we still see this relatively high use of SMS by consumers for interacting with businesses, and again across a range of use cases here. Mostly, the appointment reminders and the alerts, and receiving information about various services and so forth. But it's there across a range of use cases that we're seeing that interaction. Okay. We also asked consumers in the survey how often they use various services from, by their telcos. And a couple of ones that we pulled out here are things like sending an SMS to a business or making a payment via SMS. And as you can see here again, quite a high proportion of consumers, more than or around three quarters in China and Turkey, for example, sending SMSs to their business or their service providers, and quite a few of them are making payments as well. So again, this really highlights the importance of A2P and P2A SMS as a communications and interaction channel between consumers and their service providers. Interesting, we've got France down the bottom there, though. Sort of clearly less interest among consumers there about sending SMSs or making payments via SMS, even though there was quite high interest in the other types of customer care use cases that we surveyed. Okay. So that was, I hopefully, a bit of an insight into why I think A2P SMS is still a very relevant communications channel so far as customer care and interactions between consumers and businesses are concerned. So the next thing we obviously, this is, I think this is going to, seems like it's going to be quite the topic today, and I know that there'll be some fantastic presentations around it. But just, I guess, to give my perspective on this, and maybe just to set the scene a little bit as kind of the opening presentation for the day. So if we look at grey routing, obviously what it is and how it works, we know that it's a situation where we've got SMS aggregators terminating A2P SMSs onto telco networks, and they don't necessarily have a commercially binding a termination agreement with the telco on whose network they are ultimately terminating that traffic. They might have agreements with other links in the chain, but not necessarily directly with that telco. So, and some of the techniques they're using, obviously SIM farms come in here, where we've got these computer-based systems. These companies buy, SIM cards in bulk. Sometimes, a lot of the times, these SIM cards are using maybe consumer price plans, P2P SMS price plans, rather than they're using P2P price plans. And this is, they use these to send those bulk SMS to subscribers on the telco network. So, and that might be for legitimate traffic, but it may also be for traffic which is harmful, which does carry out that fraud that Dario referred to earlier, which is incredibly harmful and damaging for the whole A2P SMS ecosystem, and for all the players involved. Really does annoy consumers and makes them less likely to trust SMS as a channel. And I mean, some of these hackers are just incredibly sophisticated these days. So it makes it difficult, I think, for people who are less aware when they're actually getting smished or spammed by someone or a company that says it's, say, for example, here in Australia Post, but isn't actually. So these sorts of things are quite damaging. And makes consumers not want to open messages, and in some cases disengage with the channel altogether. So that's really quite as I say, damaging to the industry. Obviously, another enabler has been this interconnection of SS7 and IP networks. So, as that's another way that some of these players are getting bulk messaging out into the A2P SMS channel. They can do that online. Rather than necessarily using SIM farms and so forth. So, unfortunately, we have had these uh, um, sort of capabilities or these technologies that have enabled not only a lot of good in the world, but also have enabling some of these sort of untrustworthy parties to do the wrong thing. So obviously, the main reason they do it is because they can offer it cheaper, and so they can um, get a lot of their enterprise customers that way, and usually they're enterprise customers who may not necessarily be aware of how their messages are getting sent and being terminated. Um, Onto the telco networks, but you're quite happy not to have to pay more than they think that they should be paying. So there's a level of just a lack of awareness there, I think, particularly maybe at the smaller end of the market, and obviously at the small to medium business end of the market. It's not just lack of awareness though, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But and obviously we can see that grey routes, these they can use a number of different links in the chain, intermediaries to route their traffic across the networks, across to whichever telco they think they can terminate that A2P SMS traffic onto the network for the lowest possible price. And so it's quite a sophisticated operation that is they've got going there. So and as I was saying, so there's this kind of this vicious circle that's kind of emerged around grey routes. We've got an enterprise that might that makes a decision about how they send their SMS traffic out. Typically it's a low cost provider. As I was mentioning, small to medium enterprises may be unaware how that SMS traffic is delivered. Larger enterprises may well be aware, but they, in some cases they may be turning a bit of a blind eye in order to save on costs. There's no termination agreements, no direct termination agreements, as I was mentioning earlier. So telcos are obviously not getting appropriately compensated. They don't get that revenue for this illegal or illegitimate message termination. But you've got the legitimate SMS providers. They're losing out too, because obviously that traffic isn't traversing across their networks. There's indirect revenue loss because of the harm done to the reputation of SMS. Enterprises distrusting the channel and potentially not wanting to use it. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail here as well. SMS price erosion is obviously a huge problem because grey route providers or grey route companies that use grey routes can obviously charge lower prices, which means that the companies that are legitimately terminating A2P SMS traffic on the telco networks, they may have to reduce their SMS prices as well in order to be able to compete. So it sort of generates higher price competition and really makes it more difficult for these more legitimate SMS providers to do business, and puts the onus on them, I guess. On the flip side, it puts the onus on them to create services that help them to generate more revenues from the services side of the business in order to, and some of those services could be directly related, and that's why we've got a number to trying to stamp out grey routes themselves. So SMS firewalls and revenue assurance platforms. We've got a number of those larger sort of SMS aggregators now offering these kinds of services as well. As I mentioned previously, there's a poor user experience for the enterprise. With SMS firewalls, telcos, are able to identify that traffic that's coming onto their network, which is coming from grey routes or, which is spam, which is smishing traffic, and then they can shut that traffic down. So that means that that SMS traffic is not delivered, and obviously you've got a very unhappy enterprise there. There's a flip side to that too. It means that the telco can potentially open up discussions with that enterprise or with the SMS aggregator that's delivering traffic on behalf of that enterprise, and get those agreements, those legal agreements in place for termination on their network. And then obviously, not last but not least, is this poor user experience for the consumers as well, because grey routes are used for not only for delivering legitimate traffic, but also for some for things like spam and smishing and fraud and other sorts of exploits, which can be quite damaging and to consumers as well. So looking at what happened with grey routes in 2020, so we think there was an increase in grey route activity in 2020 as a result of the pandemic. So we think that, in last year, revenue loss had sort of almost doubled, I think, in the grey route market, because of a few key things. Obviously, there's this increased use of SMS for one-time passwords and two-factor authentication, so a lot of traffic going across the network, and maybe some of that passing over grey routes unwittingly, or unknown. We might have companies that were previously aware of that grey route dynamic, and they've previously avoided it. Maybe they, because they needed to keep a tighter lid on costs, they might have succumbed to that pressure to go down that route. And finally, we see, telcos might have seen revenue protection as a lower priority, which might have put sort of some of their platforms at a bit more risk, because they've cut back their spending. So, we're obviously seeing some other trends in the industry there as well. Some of this illegitimate sort of blending of illegitimate sort of traffic into legitimately terminated traffic to reduce costs. Some of the players, the companies that have players in their value chain that are using these grey routes, they're keeping them at arm's length. But we expect that, in 2021, telcos and other players in the A2P SMS ecosystem are going to work more to block grey routes and to protect their revenues for the rest of the ecosystem. So I just had a few sort of questions or challenges. I think the industry has some tough questions to consider, including the big ones. The title of this presentation was the return of grey routes. I mean, my sort of question on that is, have they completely gone away? Did they ever really completely go away? Can we really eradicate this problem? So, say, for example, if we've got around half of the 900 or so mobile operators that are currently operating globally, having deployed SMS firewalls and revenue assurance platforms and managed A2P SMS services across their footprint, how do we get the rest of them on board and really, try to stamp out that problem? I mean, we know that there's been a good deal of progress in this area. Numerous telcos have deployed these platforms from vendors, and there are a number of vendors in the market that are doing, a really fabulous job at that. So obviously companies like Anam and Adaptive Mobile, Howard, Route Mobile, Cinch, Conviva, Infobip, Bix. Some of these vendors are also operating SMS aggregator businesses. So there is a complementarity there as well. And obviously it's always good to, there are clearly case studies out there where SMS firewalls and revenue assurance platforms have helped telcos to recover revenues where they've deployed them. So that's obviously a very good reason for telcos to when you start talking about the money question, the revenue question, how can they generate revenues, then that's a very sort of relevant conversation for telcos to have. They're obviously more in favor of deploying those platforms if it generates them revenue or saves them on costs. And I mean, obviously there's a whole other conversation there about whether telcos should increase their A2P SMS termination rate once they've shut down grey routes into the networks, and by how much, while at the same time, they're still maintaining it as an affordable customer communications channel for enterprises. You don't want to protect that channel and then have the situation where enterprises can't afford to use it, or worse, find ways around it again to get at cheaper A2P SMS. So, and again, another question around whether telcos should use these platforms how should they use to control their A2P SMS pricing? For example, do they charge local companies one price for A2P SMS termination, and international companies, a higher price? So, I guess another question is, do you know how clean your route is to the terminating network? As an enterprise or as an SMS aggregator, how much visibility do you actually have of each provider in that chain over whose networks the SMS you're sending traverses? Do you know for sure that the telco network on which your SMS is ultimately terminated is getting paid the correct termination fees for those SMSs? And of course, obviously, there are some countries where there may not be a good choice in the market. I guess another question is, well, my third question is, do enterprises, does the market care how clean that route is if it means that they reduce their costs? Obviously, some companies, particularly the ones that have a vested interest in grey routes, they obviously don't care. If they're mostly they obviously want to get customers on board because they can charge these lower prices. But other companies may be very much focused on keeping their costs down. So again, they might be, worth, quite happy to turn a blind eye, or not be willing to probe into the potential reasons why their bulk SMS traffic costs are so cheap. So fourth question, is the A2P SMS market worth enough for the telco industry and the wider ecosystem to really want to protect it? I would say yes, given that, A2P SMS is already generating more revenues for telcos than P2P SMS. So that seems like a pretty significant revenue opportunity, and one that telcos should not be, passing up. While, SMS firewalls and revenue assurance platforms do represent an ongoing cost in terms of that continuous monitoring and updates, to ensure that maximum effectiveness against the utility, the agility, of companies that are using grey routes. That investment should really be paying off in terms of the recovered revenues. And again, there are case studies in the market that demonstrate this. And then finally, do we think that A2P RCS is going to mean the end of grey routes? Firstly, I feel that this is really only likely if enough telcos roll out A2P RCS. As I mentioned previously, there's still a lot of longevity in A2P SMS for a number of reasons. We see that there's still this really mature ecosystem around it. We have this fragmentation of messaging apps, which is holding them back in most countries around the world. It's still a lot easier for enterprises to engage with SMS than it is to engage with messaging apps. So, and even if and when we do see that wide-scale deployment of A2P RCS, there's going to be a certain amount of time when telcos are going to have to enable fallback to A2P SMS, because not every subscriber is going to have RCS on their devices. And, obviously I'm sort of thinking of iPhone users in particular here, for example. So I really feel that the grey route problem, unfortunately, even though there is a lot of good work being done, and quite a lot of telcos have actually rolled out platforms and to shut down grey routes, it's going to remain with us for a while yet, and we still need quite a concerted effort from all the players in the A2P SMS ecosystem. So think I'm getting close to the end of time. So just in terms of the takeaways, essentially, A2P SMS, it's a valuable channel, but obviously the challenge is to keep it clean. Still generating billions in dollars in revenues, but we're still seeing a substantial amount being siphoned away in grey routes. Prior to 2020, we saw many players in the ecosystem working hard to shut down grey routes and increase that A2P monetization. And in a lot of cases, these efforts are still ongoing and still very productive and effective. But we may have seen some slippage in 2020 due to COVID-19. So I think that ground will be made up again in 2021 as the situation normalizes hopefully towards the end of the year. We know that not all players in the A2P SMS ecosystem are committed to stamping out these grey routes. the harm that they do. But obviously, it can be mitigated against, and that is happening. But essentially, what we're going to need is that tipping of the balance between the players that are doing the wrong thing and those that are fully invested in keeping that channel clean. And so, again, I thank you for your attention today. Really been a pleasure to speak with you, and hopefully that's helped give you a bit of overview and insight, and hopefully help set the scene for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pamela. Thanks for sharing that with you. We only have 2 minutes, and we have many questions. So I think I'll have to be the one that decides we'll get answer. Ramon is asking for clarifications that we'll probably take that offline in terms of the access on Ramon Grip on one of the A2P SMS revenue estimates. But I think we'll come back to that if you can find out the value. Maybe meanwhile, I think Gavin is asking, prior to last year, do you believe Gavin Patterson, prior to last year, do you believe grey route traffic was decreasing on MNOs with firewalls, SS7, etc.? So you talked about doubling up to 13 billion loss, but before that, was the number reducing or was still increasing?
I think it was probably heading downwards. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but yeah, certainly I think there was a more of a downwards trend prior to last year, and it's really, I suppose, as I say, in the last 12 months that we've sort of seen maybe, as I say, a bit of slippage in that. So obviously there was a lot of good work, as I say, being done by a number of players to get that proportion of A2P SMS grey route traffic going down. But that sort of needs to be picked up again, I think, this year and heading out into because I mean, obviously we're looking at that narrowing again of grey route traffic and grey route revenues out to 2025. Quite substantially. I think we're looking at maybe that level of revenue loss getting down to maybe a third of what it is in 2020.
And I think we're running late, so I'll just read the questions. We don't have time to answer, but there was almost a comment. Rick Carlson was commenting that 10DLC in the US and possibly suggesting that could be another way to introduce grey routes, which I take part with mobile operators on weekly calls in US. I can tell you that's not the intention for their side, but interesting comment, Rick, and we'll definitely bring it back. And Robin mentioned something on the DLT blockchain in India. And Pamela, actually, we probably talked about it in the last discussions on our innovators event. And then Alex Nikolov, well, I think agreeing with you on that question about RCS, you pointed out, will RCS and the new structured RCS be able to take away so many of the revenue leakages in RCS? So I know we're running a bit late, but Pamela, I'll give you the last words. Out of all these questions, what's your final remark about the grey routes and the fraud in this market?
I just think let's keep the pressure on the grey routes, the people that are generating the traffic over grey routes. We need to get that level of trust, make sure that level of trust is there, particularly for enterprises, particularly if A2P SMS has the longevity that I think that it has. We need to keep that channel clean.
Well, I couldn't ask for a better lead, Pamela. Thank you again, because next we're going to have Paul Eccles, our advisor at MEF, talking to James Williams, Eric Driscoll, David Maxwell, and Anurag Agarwal. They're representing MEF, Risk and Assurance Group, RAG, GSMA, and i3Forum, the 4 associations that have been fighting on fraud. And then, it's your question, accountability. Let's keep them accountable. After that, we have James Williams talking to many other companies representing the other sides, as you were saying, maybe the aggregators, the enterprises, etc. So here we go. Those challenge will be taken next. But for now, Pamela, thanks again. And I hope we'll meet again soon.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.